Rob Clark, where she worked on Aboriginal outreach. Georganne has also spent a decade in the private sector in marketing and in publishing and computer industries. She has an MBA in marketing and strategic management. So let me welcome both Georganne and Adam. And I think, Adam, are you ready to open this up and then for us to throw it to Georganne? Let's see if 1 second.
I'm going to be the one who starts.
That works too. Take it away then.
You're still feedback.
I'm sorry, we're going to need a couple minutes.
Audio working on the computer. We're trying to play an audio. Do we have a technical come right away, please?
Janie, are you prepared to do your presentation? Are you prepared to do your presentation right now while we troubleshoot? Hey, come on up.
Can you hear us, Adam?
Yes, I can.
Okay, got it.
Sorry, so thank you for your flexibility. All right, thanks, Maura. Sorry, guys. Thank you so much for your patience. So I guess we'll just jump right back into it. Georganne, please go for it.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually very pleased and honored to have been asked to address this group about such an important and sensitive issue, missing and murdered Indigenous men and boys, its impact in the Indigenous society and politics of the
Can't cancel the request. We figured that. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Are we okay?
Yes.
Can I continue?
Yes.
Okay. I'm hoping to shed more light than heat on this topic and to bring greater understanding and potential for meaningful action to this discussion. I should start out by telling you that I spent 3 years working with a First Nations MP from northern Saskatchewan, Rob Clark, who is from Muskeg Lake Cree First Nation. He served as an RCMP officer doing Indigenous policing for 18 years on 7 different reserves. His experiences and the fact that he represented a riding that was almost 70% Indigenous has informed my views on this issue. With regard to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, a little history is in order. Over a very long period, dating back to almost the turn of the 20th century, there have been over 40 separate government-sponsored inquiries into this tragedy. The basic conclusion of the vast majority of these studies was that sadly these women were living in violent and dangerous environments, extreme poverty with dysfunctional families. Many were killed on their own home territory, others had left home and found themselves in risk-filled lifestyles away from their homes and were vulnerable to violence. The RCMP did several studies, which we cannot assume were not to some degree self-serving, but the numbers do show that the solve rate on these deaths and disappearances was almost the same as all others, approximately 90%. My former boss, Rob Clark, bore this out. He in fact solved every one of his missing and murdered women and girls cases, pointing out that some of the missing women and girls begged him not to tell their families where they were. However, my former boss also told me something that took my breath away. Georganne, did you know that 2/3 of all missing Indigenous people are men and boys? I was gobsmacked. Not only did I not know this, I had never heard it mentioned before that day. What is most shocking is that still today, the Indigenous community activists continue to be in denial or to make excuses for this phenomenon. Men can defend themselves more easily than women. They are by their nature more violent, which I find interesting form of victim blaming. And they engage in high-risk behavior, etc. As a mother of 3 sons, a wife to 1 husband, and a sister to 4 brothers, I have a hard time valuing their lives less than those of my sister and daughters. And I know that the mothers and sisters and aunties and grandmas of these men and boys suffer as much as they would if their loved one was of the other gender. We must ask ourselves to try to dispassionately examine why this is the situation, why men and boys' lives are so devalued, and what we can do to change this sad and shameful situation. Interestingly, whenever I've brought this statistic to the attention of First Nations leaders and activists, they're all aware of it. Some in hushed voices express concern and regret over it. A few, like Chief Ernie Cray, courageously speak out about it. But nothing has been done to address this problem and to treat it with the same concern and care as women and girls. So what can we do? How can we outline the problem in a way that makes sense to the policymakers and community leaders to encourage them to take action and find a solution for the violence, poverty, and dysfunction that has led to this? Are we dealing with a problem endemic to Indigenous communities, or is this a function of societal issues? I think the answer lies in looking at Indigenous communities that are successful and examining why they are successful. Everyone needs to read about Chief Clarence Louis and the Osoyoos First Nation if you've not done so. This community has virtually 0 unemployment, is wealthy, and is run efficiently and attentively by this 55-year-old chief. There is an article by Jake McDonald in Globe and Mail which tells the story of Osoyoos. You should all read it. This was a typical impoverished and unsuccessful Indigenous community in the late 1980s and 1990s, early 90s. Clarence Louis decided that had to change. His story is amazing and shows that with the right leadership and fearlessness and courage, First Nations communities can succeed. We all know that a lack of leadership on the family level, on the community level, on the organizational level is a recipe for failure. This chief makes no excuses for or exceptions for bad habits or bad policies or bad behavior in anyone in the community. He is deeply involved in every facet of community life and has had a lasting impact on 2 or 3 generations of this community. In addition, he is a national model for leadership, Indigenous and otherwise. Why am I telling you about this amazing chief? Because he has directly addressed the problems in his community: poverty, violence, education, health. As a result, crime is low and violence is reduced. When people are working, healthy, and getting the basics of education needed to function in society, life improves on all levels. In addition, this chief is directly involved with the youth of his community, letting them know that he has high standards for not only himself, but for them. In the Globe article, there are great stories of how his direct intervention and strong leadership changed young lives. The community with the highest number of reported missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is Sackheap First Nation in northern Manitoba. This community has an active chief and council, newly elected, which is taking strong action against their biggest problem facing their community, drug addiction. They actually recently broke up a meth factory, I guess you would call it, that was in their community. As you can easily guess, this is a source of violence and dysfunction in any community. Indigenous communities are no different. Leaders who take on these problems forcefully can send a message to the entire community, much like Clarence Louis has. I guess my point is that leadership is the key to success in Indigenous communities. Leadership that acknowledges the problems and does something about them. Leadership that is not corrupt. Leaders who lead by example, not leaders who, in hushed voices, express regret and concern over issues. At this point, I should say a little bit about my background. It was mentioned that I've worked in politics and that I'm a senior vice president with what is a government relations firm. At my core, I'm a grassroots organizer in the political world. As a result, I often look at problems through a political lens. I understand that principled and competent leadership can make the difference between a successful country, province, city, community, or any organization for that matter, and one that is doomed to fail. The fact that Indigenous leaders have not taken up the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous men and boys is an example of failure. Why would they not be as concerned about their men and boys? Why is the issue named missing? Why is the issue not named missing and murdered Indigenous people? If any of you followed the recent federal inquiry, you're likely aware of the following things. The inquiry refused to address missing and murdered Indigenous males. The organization that's sponsoring this conference was directly involved in trying to get this on the agenda, and they were turned down. The inquiry arrived at the conclusion that Canada is guilty of genocide. The Prime Minister concurred in this conclusion, putting Canada in the sights of international commissions. This process was firmly in the control of a highly ideological, anti-male, anti-Canadian group. As long as I've dealt with Indigenous issues, the fringe ideologues have been chomping at the bit to accuse Canada of genocide. But apparently men and boys aren't included in this accusation and don't count as victims of this genocide. So what can be done about this? How do we raise awareness of this horrible miscarriage of justice? How do we get our government, and most importantly, First Nations leadership and organizations, to give this problem the attention it deserves? We cannot ignore the root causes behind the dysfunction, including the residential schools, the 60s scoop, and other acts and eras of infamy in Canadian history. Hopefully, we will be aware of these factors, and we will recognize that we must not operate in a vacuum. That will hopefully be the point of this discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing your views and ideas. Thank you very much.
Adam, you gonna speak
Can
now?
you hear me?
Yeah.
Adam, are you ready?
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hi from the other side of the world, everybody. I'm in a small town called Stung Treng in northern Cambodia on the Mekong River. Thanks to the wonders of technology, I can participate in this august event, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming out and listening. As was touched upon in the introduction for me earlier on, I've done a lot of academic work over the years on gender and mass violence, including the study of so-called gendercide or gender-selective mass killing, which I, unlike the original framers of that concept, have tried to approach in an inclusive way, addressing men and boys as well as women and girls. I've done a lot of related work on gender and international relations, and I teach a course by that title at UBC, which similarly attempts to take an inclusive approach. And very gratifyingly, in the years that I've been teaching that, I've found that students of every stripe have really responded empathetically to the notion of an inclusive approach to discussions of gender and politics, gender and violence, victimization, and so on. So that kind of informs where I'm coming from here. The theme of genocide, which has been my academic specialization, is of course one that touches directly on the framing and the conclusions of the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Without going into a great deal of detail, I think it's fair to say that the notion of genocide, the concept of genocide, is very much an essentially contested one, as we say in the social sciences. It's hard to find two scholars that will agree precisely on what is referenced by the term. There is certainly room, going back to the original crafter of that concept and the inventor of the word, a Polish-Jewish jurist named Raphael Lemkin, to look at genocide in a very sociological sense as including a kind of coordinated campaign against all aspects of life and health and culture and dignity and identity of the targeted group. And I think that that original Lemkian concept is one that resonates particularly well with Aboriginal peoples. around the world who have been on the receiving end of precisely that kind of coordinated colonial and post-colonial campaign. With regard to the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, they issue a finding of, quote, from page 50 of volume 1, a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, which is also something that I have supported in my own writings on genocide of Indigenous peoples. But they go on to say, which especially targets women, girls, and forgive the very clumsy acronym, 2SLGBTQIA people. This is, of course, the nub of the problem when we talk about applying genocide in this selective fashion. Why is it that the genocide is deemed to be especially directed against women and girls when, for example, the
I don't know if you can hear me, Adam, but we just lost you.
I think he's gone
Entirely, and we lost the feed for Georganne. You know, until Adam's getting himself back up again, and I hope he does get himself back up again. Georganne, would you be willing to take a couple of questions?
Sure.
Yeah, great. So just to fill in a little bit more, Georganne was, as she said, she's with a public relations firm that was instrumental also in helping the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Inquiry deal with us. So you can ask her about the issues that had to do with CAFE as well.
Robert, some people are having trouble hearing you.
I'm sorry. There's
Adam.
Adam.
Speak right into the
Adam's
microphone.
back.
Everybody catch the last little bit that I was mentioning about the framing of genocide?
We lost the last 30 or 45 seconds. That's it.
Okay. I just wanted to say basically that the problem with applying genocide in this context is that, of course, to define it as primarily or especially a genocide against women and girls avoids the fact that, for example, Aboriginal men and boys constitute a large majority of Indigenous homicide victims. Now, this is very typical of feminist framings of gender and violence, including mass violence. There has been a little movement on this front in recent years. I'm pleased to say more sophisticated and nuanced framings of the subject in the feminist literature, but I do not see that reflected in the report. It is a very traditional, almost 1980s style approach to the problem of gender and violence. We see this reflected in a number of ways. There is first of all, a valorization and sanctification of women. There is a section of the report, volume 1, that is titled, "Women Are the Heart of Their Communities." And I was struck by that phrase. Well, what body part are men in their communities? Are men not equally the heart of their communities? Likewise, one sees repeated this phrase, our women and girls are sacred. Accepting that to be true, are men's and boys' lives any less sacred or valuable? Does that mean that they are not sacred? Unfortunately, it probably does from the perspective of the authors. Men and boys are largely ignored throughout, and their victimizations experiences are excluded or marginalized. There's one very contrary quote that comes in the second volume of the report from Métis Perspectives. It's not mentioned who's the particular individual making the statement. The statement is as follows: men are our throwaway people. We are so quick to throw them under the bus. And it's one of the very few times in the report that one gets a comment along those lines, and I think it can serve as something of a guideline for our discussions here, because the report, of course, likewise has thrown Indigenous men and boys under the bus. And at no point in the report is there any attempt to explain or justify that exclusion. It is simply a taboo topic. It is not felt that the disproportionate, overwhelming, indeed exclusive focus on women and girls requires any explanation. Men and boys do make occasional appearances in the 2 volumes of the report, but ironically, the greatest empathy for them is actually reserved for them in their role as perpetrators of violence against women and girls. There's a little over a page, around page 37 and 38 of volume 2, that emphasizes that we need to understand the background of privation and oppression that men and boys have experienced and how this feeds into women and girls. Men and boys as victims appear very occasionally, very tangentially, and are clearly not accorded anything remotely like the attention and empathy of women and girls. So we get a very powerful treatment of the victimization of Indigenous females, a well-documented, well-researched, well-written, anecdotally rich account that I think everyone should read despite the absences and failings here. There has been a lot of work put into it, and obviously the questions and subjects and individuals who are being addressed are very much worthy of that attention. And that would include certain gender-specific forms of discrimination against females in these communities. For example, the granting of status under the Indian Act and other issues. But in general, what we get is a very rich and detailed portrait, I think, of the systematic and multifaceted oppression that has been visited upon Aboriginal people as a whole in this country. I think it is our greatest shame as a nation. I think it is our greatest crisis today as a nation. And then we get an extension of that exclusively in the direction of the women and girl victims. And I really think that is shameful. And anything that can be done to counter that, to supplement it, and to make it a more rich and nuanced perspective by incorporating the other 50% of the Aboriginal populations is something that we really need to look at. And this is, I'll conclude with this, this is particularly relevant, I think, when we look at themes like homicide, suicide, and incarceration. The report deals with all of these at length, but exclusively with regard to women and girls who are directly targeted and affected. When we look at homicide, we know that roughly 70% of Aboriginal victims are male. When we look at suicide, we know that men and boys commit suicide in Aboriginal communities at a rate approximately 4 times higher than that of women and girls. And when we look at incarceration, even though it's incredibly difficult to find these statistics, and I had to do some digging around and juggling on this, so take this for what it is worth, but as best as I can come up with, the total number of incarcerated men and youth, male youth, is 10 times greater in Canada than the number of incarcerated women and adolescent girls. And what we get in the report is a framing of these issues that leads one to suspect that women are being disproportionately targeted, an attention to highly selective statistics that emphasize the most disturbing elements of the experience of women and girls, and a systematic and obviously unjustified exclusion of the other half of Aboriginal peoples in our society. So thank you for that so slightly interrupted intro, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Adam. And also thank you. We have time for a number of questions, I think. So direct yourselves.
I think, Robert, what will be interesting is that Adam and I came to some very similar conclusions, and we come at this problem from very different perspectives. He's an academic who has spent a long time, obviously, investigating the issues around gender, things around gender issues, specifically around Aboriginal issues. And I come at it from a political perspective, but we both arrived at the same conclusion that if you're going to call something genocide, genocide implies an entire people. And you can't ignore half of the people, either politically or sociologically, and have genocide make any sense. So that's one thing for sure. And the other point I think that's interesting is we both come to the same conclusion that men and boys suffer the, I will say perhaps the outcomes of the dysfunction in Indigenous society, which has its roots in a variety of different things. I would start with, with the Indian Act itself, and go to, residential schools, the 60s scoop, and all of the other things that have occurred over the history of Indigenous people in Canada. So they've suffered far more significantly than the women have, and that's not to minimize what happens to women and girls at all, but it's just to point out that that there's a willful blindness, and it's on the parts of our own government here in Canada, and I will, even as a conservative, I'll lay blame at the door of previous conservative prime ministers as well as the others, and it also is definitely a fault of Indigenous community leaders who, for some reason, close their eyes to this issue. I don't understand it. I keep asking the question, and I haven't gotten a satisfactory answer once from anyone.
It may be that the answer is in dividing people into anything, including into genders at a top level, which is...
Could I just make one follow-up comment there? I think...
just before you do, Adam, give me 1 second.
Sure.
Let's take questions, but if you don't mind, stand at the microphone so that we can get a good audio of it, and then we can also take you in turn. I'm sorry, Adam, go ahead.
No problem. Georganne's comments, I think, are extremely well taken, and I'm also impressed by the way that we arrive at similar conclusions by our different routes. I just wanted to make one further elucidation on the genocide framing here. One of the other analytical and conceptual problems that the authors of the report kind of skate over is that it's pretty clear, let's limit ourselves to the question of murdered Aboriginal people, that the large majority of perpetrators in those cases, both in the killings of Aboriginal women and of Aboriginal men, are themselves Indigenous people. And the report at various points says, this has not been strictly verified, and raises a lot of insinuations that the situation could be different. I don't think it is, and I think homicide around the world is traditionally and generally overwhelmingly an intra-racial and intra-ethnic phenomenon. And for example, in the United States, with regard to homicides of African Americans, it's about 93% of other African Americans that are the perpetrators in these cases. So for the authors of the report to challenge or seek to undermine the notion that roughly 70% of Aboriginal women victims might be targeted by Aboriginals, is highly questionable in itself. Now, the fact that that is intra-group does not necessarily rule out a genocide framing. There's quite a lot of nuanced work that has been done on the way that structural violence operates in these cases, and for what it's worth, I'm quite open to these kind of framings of the phenomenon. But it is something that is downplayed and marginalized in the report, and I think that we need to get to grips with, because at the very least it doesn't fit the standard and stereotypical model of what genocide is.
Thank you, Adam. We've got our first question here.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
thank you. Adam and Georganne, you've described a phenomenon that's almost as interesting as the subject of the report. That's the decision to exclude Aboriginal men and boys.
I can't hear the question, I don't know.
I'm sorry, that mic isn't active.
Go ahead and I'll summarize for you.
This is the
Go
mic.
ahead, ask the question, I'll try and summarize for you.
Well, I've done it if you want.
You can come down if you like, yes.
No, you said you're going to repeat what I said. You want to go ahead, TJ? Did you hear what I said?
I didn't catch what you
Okay,
said.
so Adam and Georganne, you've described a phenomenon that is interesting as the subject of the report, which is the exclusion of Aboriginal men and boys. Now we're talking about the conclusion of genocide, as you pointed out the irony of that conclusion. Do you want to say more about why and how that decision was made? That seems to be a very significant decision. Can you tell us more about that?
The question references the issue of genocide and how it excludes men and boys, with the actual question being, can you explain how that conclusion came to be?
I'll jump on here and let the academic follow me because he may have more data. Having worked in the political world, as I said, for a very, very, very many decades in two countries, I have seen an evolution in the political movement for women, which I believe is permitting this to happen. Full disclosure, I was a very left-wing Democrat, and Robert knows this about me. In my, not just my early days, I did not leave the Democratic Party until 2012. But that was when I felt the Democratic Party had actually left me. So I held very left-wing views, very strong feminist views, until somehow I felt that the feminist movement had left me as well. It became more about, less about empowering women and more about making women into victims and helpless victims unable to take care of themselves. I think that this is a big part of the mental kind of the thought behind, or the mental process behind saying that women are more victims in the Indigenous communities than men. I think that they prefer to look at women, prefer to make women victims, and prefer that men be perpetrators, because I believe that, I don't think this is just something that we're seeing in Indigenous communities. I think we're seeing it in many other places. And I will tell you this, my former boss, Rob Clark, who is a very astute observer of what goes on in the Indigenous political world, he said there's a huge victim industry, oftentimes made up, by the way, not people from the Indigenous communities. It is oftentimes made up of ideologues who are coming from the outside world into these communities, carrying their ideas in and bringing these ideas to kind of overlay whatever is happening in the community. And I think that's exactly what we saw here. That we saw, although the committee itself was made up of Indigenous leaders, well-known people, some academics, and so forth. The fact is that the underlying theory behind all of this was that women are victims, men are the perpetrators. There is no in-between anything, and they completely ignore and deny, which is insane to me, that 2/3 of missing and murdered Indigenous people are men and boys, and they're only half the population. So I think it has to be coming from a mentality, a mental state which says women are victims, men are perpetrators. I'm sure Adam has actual statistics to back that up, not just gut reactions like my own that come from my years of observation.
And just before we get to you, Adam, because I'm very interested, first of all, I want to apologize to the questioner for not making the question as full as he made it. But you are getting the idea, and we're running a little bit late, so Adam, give us the most succinct analysis that you can.
Sure. One of the things that strikes me in the wake of Georganne's comments that I didn't mention is that there is indeed a huge gulf in the report with regard to female perpetrators. Even if one is talking only about women and girl victims, surely not a totality of the perpetrators are male, particularly in a context of domestic violence and parental violence. And that is virtually totally absent except for a couple of anecdotes that I can think of in the report. One has to read between the lines. I would back what Georganne said about the typical kind of victim-perpetrator framing. I mentioned before that I think in academia, feminist writings about gender and violence have become more nuanced and inclusive in this regard, including of female perpetrators. But institutions change a lot more slowly. And this report is the product of institutional processes, and I think entrenched and vested interests that are still very much locked in an ideological mindset of 25 or 30 years ago. Last point I want to respond to is why the framing of genocide. I've suggested that this may be the most powerful word in the English language. And it's an invented word, of course, invented only in 1943. So that's doubly interesting. But one of the reasons that I think groups seek to graft their cause onto a genocide framing is to access the power of the word. And one has a sense with the authors of the report that they are casting around for a framing of genocide that will allow them to apply it to the Aboriginal experience. With a political goal in mind of maximizing the shock value of their findings. Now, it's a term that's always going to be politicized. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think we need to understand that it's being approached in a rather means to an end context here.
I know we only had time for maybe a couple of questions. We'll take one more. It's got to be very, very quick, though. I think I saw your hand first.
Okay. If I may, I must thank you, Mr. Chauncier, for all your efforts on these great important causes. I'd like to make the point to the speakers that the term genocide is really not a term to play with. And it was created by a man named Raphael Lemkin. And the creation of that word came at the bidding of President Roosevelt.
You're not hearing this, Georganne and Adam, are you?
Yeah, I'm hearing
A little bit of it. Not totally theory, but getting the gist of it.
Good.
It was to create a legal procedure, procedures by which to process and judge the Nazi war criminals. And that is why the whole process developed as it did, and we ended up, it developed into the judgments. It's called the judgments in Nuremberg, but it was trials in Nuremberg. So the term genocide is a very serious term, and it has a very serious, severe background because it was asked because Mr. Roosevelt did not want to appear like savages as the war criminals were.
Thank you. So if you heard that, it's a question about the history of the concept of genocide. Would either of you like to comment on that?
Well, that's something that I've done a lot of work on, and I have to differ somewhat with the questioner there. Lemkin, from the early 1930s, was searching for a word that he thought would encompass the targeting of religious and ethnic minorities worldwide. He was not particularly focused on the case of the Jews, and certainly not the Jews under the Nazis, because they hadn't come to power when he first began those investigations. He was probably more directly influenced by the Armenian genocide. And I would just add in closing that one of the things that is really notable about his writings on the subject is that he was unusually empathetic towards Indigenous peoples worldwide. One of his earliest detailed case studies of genocide, for example, was of the Tasmanian Aboriginals. And unlike many scholars of the period, I believe that he crafted his concept in part with the kind of multifaceted and systematic campaigns of colonialism against Indigenous peoples very much in mind, even before the Nazi Holocaust.
I would agree with that. I'm one of probably the very few Jews that you come across who didn't get extremely bent out of shape with the use of genocide as a term to describe what the goal was of the policies that Canada had regarding Indigenous people. What I did take offense at was that it was very narrowly defined to include only women, and that they didn't actually clarify how policies could be defined, how these policies could be defined as genocide, and did not make the connection clear between the historical policies and how they could define this as genocide. And what they did then was a very dangerous thing, and once again, this is my political self coming out, they did a very dangerous thing, which was open Canada to accusations from very large international organizations of, well, you know, if you're guilty of genocide, we're going to investigate you. You need to not throw the word around. If you're going to say that that is in fact the case, you best be able to line it up with reality and fact. And I don't think that Canada can be looked at today as a genocidal society, but you could look at the policies that led to the condition that we find our First Peoples in as a form of genocide. I don't think it is the same as the genocide of Armenia. I don't think it's the same as the genocide of Rwanda. I don't think it's the same as the genocide of the Nazis and the Jews. But it came very close. The only thing that they did not do was mass murders. That was the one thing that was left out, mass murders of First Nations people. But they did things that led to their deaths and are still, you know, as we see today, leading to their deaths. So in that sense, I guess I take that position.
Thank you, Adam and Georganne, for joining us this morning. For late evening, in the case of Adam, I'm not exactly sure what time it is there. I appreciate you making this work. Thanks to the audience for your patience. Now, and if you bear with us a moment or so, I think we're going to say goodbye to Georganne and Adam, and we're going to queue up Janie's presentation. So just give us a moment to do that. Janie, why don't you join me up here, and we'll introduce you.
I'm sorry, did I get the name on the sheet that she...
Bernie Frey, C-R-E-Y.
I think it's the other sheet. The first one that you talked about.
Oh, I was out of the room, I'm sorry. You know the name? behind on her lunch. Okay, please take your seats. I am really, really excited to introduce our next speaker, J.D. Perez. J.D. has been one of our most effective volunteers, and if everybody could please take their seats, we're gonna continue with the program. I've had the pleasure of working very closely with J.D. over a number of years now. She's been put in charge of a number of important research projects for CAFE. She's going to comment on one of those projects this morning, but let me tell you a little bit about J.D. J.D. has a